Harriet knew something was dreadfully wrong the moment she caught the twisted reflection in her bedroom window. The night outside was fluid, rippling with a subtle shimmer. Though the window glass was thin, it distorted the moonlight enough to create a warped version of the world. Harriet swore she could see the shape of the crater on the horizon, a crescent of blackness that smoldered with unearthly light. That crater had appeared just 2 days before, birthed when a celestial spark tore across the sky and crashed into the fields north of the village. Everyone in town had rushed toward the impact site, some out of curiosity, others out of panic. Harriet had stayed back, lurking at the fringe of her farmland, ignoring the trembling earth beneath her feet. She had known in her soul that no good would come of it. The morning after the meteor struck, rumors slithered through the village. People had suffered sudden dizzy spells, intrusive thoughts, and, most disturbingly, a cacophony of whispering voices just beyond the threshold of hearing. Harriet had experienced something far worse. Waking in a cold sweat, she had seen Henry, her late husband, sitting on the edge of her bed. His eyes were glassy, his face pitted with guilt or sorrow. She couldn't tell which. He had reached out to her, but she had instinctively shrunk away, a hollow sensation growing in her chest. After that chilling vision, he vanished, and Harriet understood that Henry's ghost wasn't real. It was a hallucination planted in her head by that unholy cosmic rock. Her chest constricted with anxiety as she realized a horrifying truth. If the meteor could reach into somebody's mind, it could unearth secrets perhaps best left buried. When Harriet reluctantly joined the men and women who trudged through the pasture to investigate the impact site, the crater left by the meteor was more immense up close, wide enough to swallow half the orchard. Ragged lines of scorched earth spread out like spider legs from the center. The meteor itself, about the size of a small boulder, flickered with an otherworldly sheen, a swirl of turquoise and dull gold that seemed to shift with each breath of wind. No one dared approach it at first, but eventually the mayor, a deliberate man named Colin Fawcett, and a few adventurous villagers crept close to see if it was radioactive. Harriet kept her distance, eyes on the meteor. She could have sworn it vibrated in a faint, rhythmic pulse, almost like a heartbeat. Then the humming started. It rolled through the air in waves, a sound that pressed against Harriet's eardrums and chilled her bones. This was no ordinary noise. It reminded her of chanting in an underground chamber, a sense of voices layered on top of each other until they merged into a single, suffocating drone. Colin, half collapsed on the edge of the crater, yelled for everyone to back away. The villagers scrambled, but the sound reached them anyway. Harriet felt it ripple across her mind like a hungry tide, as if searching for cracks in her psyche. She tried to pinch her ears, shut her eyes, but the pulse throbbed within her skull, deeper than even silence could contain. It subsided after a few horrific seconds, leaving behind a trembling confusion. That night, Harriet's darkest memory returned. She dreamed of the stormy night when she and Henry had argued with such ferocity that he tore out of the house. He had driven off into the rain-drenched roads in a fury. Harriet had discovered him the next morning, his truck nose down in the ditch, body pinned against the dashboard with no sign of life. Ever since, she had carried an immense burden of guilt. The dream now manifested in heightened detail, as though urged to the surface by some malignant force. She woke, her heartbeat racing, convinced that the meteor's presence was prying open her mind. She felt helpless, and the guilt she'd wrestled with for years began consuming her every thought. She wasn't alone in her silent torment. Across the village, more people complained of strange apparitions. Aveline Baker, the resident schoolteacher, confided that she'd seen her father, who had died when she was a teen. Walter Green, the blacksmith, swore he'd woken up to find his deceased mother standing over him, weeping tears of blood. Rumors spread that these ghosts were not comforting presences, but rather menacing illusions. Others reported hearing the voices of old lovers, children they had abandoned, or friends they had betrayed. Day by day, the apparitions thickened, fusing with the gloom so that the entire village seemed perpetually haunted. Colin instituted a curfew, urging everyone to stay indoors after dark, though it accomplished little. Fear nested in every home. Doors slammed shut at twilight, windows were boarded, and families huddled together with lamps burning. Yet in that hush, the unceasing hum from the crater became inescapable. If the wind was right, it seemed to play along the rooftops like a ghostly flute. Harriet couldn't tell if any of these nightmares were real or just the mania spreading. All she knew was that she was haunted nightly by Henry, sometimes glowering at her with unspoken blame, other times snapping his head toward her in accusation. She would scream herself awake, ears ringing with the hum that never left. Seeking solace, Harriet decided to make the trip to the mayor's house. The wide main street of the village was deserted, dust rattling across the cobblestones in the chilly breeze. She tried to ignore the shapes she saw in her peripheral vision, shadows that flickered as if they were people just out of sight. Mayor Colin answered the door with hollow cheeks and red-rimmed eyes, looking like he hadn't slept in days. When Harriet explained her apparitions, he nodded grimly. He too suffered from similar horrors. He confessed that he had burned down his neighbor's barn some years ago to cover his own mishandling of property lines, though no one ever discovered the truth. The guilt had always nagged at the corners of his conscience. Now that guilt was manifested each night as the neighbor's frightened horses screaming in his dreams. Harriet felt an odd sense of both repulsion and empathy. "What do we do?" Harriet asked, her voice unsteady. "Can we destroy it? The meteor?" "I don't know if that's even possible," Colin replied, massaging his temples. "But maybe we can remove it, or bury it. Anything to stop it from affecting us." Colin called a meeting that afternoon in the courtyard behind the town hall. Folks arrived in pairs or small clusters, all of them wary of the possibility that the hallucinations might overwhelm them in broad daylight. Lucy Merriweather, the local doctor, volunteered to administer sedatives to anyone on the verge of hysteria, but Harriet noticed Lucy was shaky, and she suspected the woman was fighting her own inner horrors. People whispered among themselves, the tension thick enough to soak the air. At last, Colin addressed the cowering crowd. "We have to find a way to deal with that thing in the crater," he said. "We'll begin by trying to move it. If it's causing these illusions, maybe we can lock it away somewhere." Many muttered protests. Could it be moved without harming them? Did they have the tools for such a feat? Voices quavered, and Harriet felt the flicker of paranoia among those gathered. She could see it in their eyes. They feared that possessing this rock might unleash untold horrors. But faced with continuing nightmares, they sensed no other choice. When the meeting ended, a handful of volunteers, including Harriet, Colin, Walter the blacksmith, and Lucy, trudged back to the crater, hauling ropes and metal hooks. The plan was straightforward. Wrap the meteor in thick canvas to dampen whatever energies it emitted, and then use a pulley system to haul it onto a wagon. Once they had it firmly strapped, they would transport it into the old stone church down the road, where they could store it behind thick walls. That was the theory, at least. Harriet tried not to think about how absurd it all sounded. The methodical approach frayed as soon as they reached the crater. The closer they got, the louder that thrumming noise became, vibrating in Harriet's chest, making her heart flutter. A sudden wave of dizziness coursed through her, and she collapsed to one knee, nauseous. She glimpsed the rest of them wincing, doubling over, or pressing their palms to their ears. Lucy gestured for them to pause, rummaging in her bag for sedatives, but before she could distribute anything, a flicker at the crater's edge drew Harriet's gaze. A figure stood there, shimmering vaguely in the midday sun, uncertain and transparent. Harriet recognized him instantly. Henry. He gazed at her with hollow eyes, and though he didn't speak, his lips parted in silent accusation. A paralyzing sense of guilt speared her. She wasn't the only one haunted. Colin moaned, pointing into the crater, his face pale as plaster. Harriet saw multiple apparitions drifting around like theater props. A wild-eyed man with a scorched barn jacket, a teen girl with tear-stained cheeks, an elderly woman with a vacant stare. Each volunteer must have been seeing someone from their own darkest regrets. Walter roared, flailing his arms to ward off the phantom of his mother, who appeared behind him, eyes dripping red tears. The illusions were so vivid that Harriet could almost smell the dampness of Henry's shirt and sense the heartbreak emanating from his silent form. Summoning her last ounce of composure, she squeezed her eyes shut and staggered forward, rope in hand. The air hummed so loudly now that her teeth rattled. As she reached the brink of the pit, she dropped to her knees and tossed an end of the rope around the Meteor's warped surface. The rock glowed with a hypnotic swirl. An indescribable sense of anguish rippled from it, as though it fed on the collective guilt of everyone around. Harriet's insides quaked at the thought of fueling this cosmic abomination with her shame and fear. Walter, fighting tears, joined her, hooking his end of the rope under a jagged outcrop in the stone. He didn't say a word but nodded stiffly. Lucy assisted, wrapping the Meteor in the heavy canvas. As soon as the fabric draped over it, the humming lessened, if only slightly. Harriet and the group managed to tighten the cloth around the Meteor's circumference, then lashed it with rope. With painstaking effort, they maneuvered it onto some planks set near the crater's lip and dragged it upward, inch by agonizing inch. The illusions flickered in and out of their vision, phantoms edging forward every time one of them wavered. Harriet heard Lucy's shaky exhale as she saw her own apparitions behind closed eyes. At last, the Meteor slid onto the wagon bed. Harriet nearly collapsed in relief, her arms burned, muscles trembling like a frayed wire. Walter secured the canvas with extra rope while Colin wiped sweat from his brow. The illusion still lurked, but with the Meteor contained, the worst of the thrumming stayed at bay. Each volunteer dared to hope that maybe they could starve out its wicked influence by locking it away somewhere remote. It took over an hour to haul the wagon to the old stone church on the outskirts of the village. The building had stood for centuries, its foundation thick with mortar that had survived countless storms. Harriet remembered going there as a child, listening to the organ echo under the vaulted ceiling. Now, the church's doors creaked in protest as they were forced open. The interior was cool and dark. They rolled the wagon to the center aisle and unloaded the Meteor. With an empty sense of ceremony, the group lugged it down a side corridor leading to a disused door. They positioned it against the wall and left it swaddled in canvas, roped like a captive demon. Lucy let out a shaky breath. "Let's see if that helps," she said, her voice hushed as if they stood at a funeral. "Everyone should go home, try to rest." They dispersed quickly, no one keen to linger. Harriet lingered just a moment, casting a final glance at the bound shape in the gloom. She wondered if it would remain contained, or if the illusions would multiply the moment they turned their backs. That evening, Harriet found no respite. When she tried to read under the golden lamplight in her sitting room, her head throbbed with an ache that pinned her to the couch. Her mind drifted back to Henry. She remembered him standing in the yard, raging at her with words they were both too proud to withdraw. He roared, and she fought back, and the storm whipped around them, carrying away any shred of reconciliation. That memory repeated in her mind like a broken record. Suddenly, something pounded at her door. Harriet rose, unsteady on numb feet. She opened the door to find Lucy standing there, hair disheveled, eyes red. The doctor looked haunted. She slipped inside, trembling. "It's not gone," Lucy whispered. "We have new cases of hallucinations. Worse, perhaps. Some have started hurting themselves or each other. There was a brawl near the bar. People aren't in control of their minds anymore." Harriet's pulse hammered. "But we covered the Meteor. It's locked away in stone walls. How can its effects be this strong?" Lucy closed her eyes, tears escaping down her face. "I don't know, but it's feeding off the entire village. It's not just about physically containing it anymore. It's inside us." The dreadful chill of the last words lodged in Harriet's ribs. She offered Lucy a seat and fetched her a glass of water. They sat in silence, listening to the faint whistling of the wind outside, which carried a barely discernible note of that dreaded hum. Sometime before dawn, Harriet dozed off, only to wake to Lucy screaming as if possessed. Harriet jolted upright to find Lucy staring at the far corner of the room, eyes wild. Harriet couldn't see anything there, but Lucy gasped, "My baby! Oh God, I never told anyone. I'm sorry." Harriet recognized that Lucy was lost in the illusions dredged up by the Meteor, some personal tragedy or guilt from her past. Gently, Harriet held the doctor's hands, speaking calming words. Lucy trembled, tears pouring down her cheeks, until she finally snapped out of it. She clung to Harriet's arm, her breath ragged. Harriet didn't ask Lucy to explain her visions. It was clear enough the woman was tormented by a secret sin, now laid bare by the meteor's influence. By morning, the entire village was in chaos. A thick gloom hung over the houses. People stumbled through the street, eyes vacant. The illusions moved among them like wandering ghosts. Some residents barricaded themselves indoors. Others seemed to roam aimlessly, driven mad by guilt or unshakable sorrow. Through a haze of exhaustion, Harriet resolved that they needed a decisive action, something more drastic than simply storing the meteor away. She hurried to the mayor's house, finding it in a state of disarray. Colin was nowhere to be seen, but eventually Harriet tracked him to the town hall. He was crouched in a corner, rocking back and forth, drenched in sweat, muttering about the barn he'd burned down. Harriet knelt beside him, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. He blinked, focusing on her face, tears in his eyes. "This can't go on," Harriet whispered. "We'll lose ourselves." He pressed a shaking hand to his forehead, nodding. "We have to get rid of it entirely. We have to destroy the meteor." Harriet pursed her lips. "But how do we destroy a rock from beyond the stars? We don't have explosives. We have pitch, torches, metalworks." Colin's eyes flashed with a desperate idea. "Walter's forge. If we can heat it to unimaginable temperatures, maybe it will crack or melt. I don't know if it's possible, but it's worth a shot." And so a new plan emerged in the gloom of that dreadful morning. Harriet, Colin, Lucy, and Walter assembled their last vestiges of courage. They would transport the meteor from the old church to Walter's forge, and there attempt to reduce it to slag. It was a gamble. If the meteor was truly unbreakable, they risked spreading its influence further. But they had no other option. Better to fight than to be devoured by the illusion. The old church door creaked open, revealing the meteor still in place, wrapped tight in its canvas cocoon. It pulsed with a faint glow, as if it was able to break through the thick fabric. Harriet felt her throat tighten. Walter lit torches along the corridor to better see, the flickering light casting ominous shadows on the walls. Up close, Harriet could hear that constant hum once more, pressing against her eardrums. This time, there was no sign of illusions in the corridor, though she suspected they lingered in the corners, waiting for a moment of weakness. The four of them maneuvered the meteor onto a stout cart that Walter normally used for hauling iron ingots. Walter's forge stood near the edge of the village, a squat building with worn brick walls. Its chimney rose into the cloudy sky like a watchtower. As they trundled along, Harriet saw faces at windows, hollow-eyed villagers who watched with expressions that were either hopeful or terrified. Wind rattled the shutters, and a child cried out from behind a locked door. Harriet bit her lip. She had to believe that burning the meteor would free everyone's minds from this psychic plague. Inside the forge, Walter stirred the coals into a roaring inferno. He and Colin shoveled more fuel, fanning the flames to a blazing white heat. The temperature soared, sweat pouring down their bodies. Lucy and Harriet kept watch on the door and windows, barricading them so no panicked villagers could rush in or sabotage the operation. Harriet suspected that mania might drive some to worship the meteor, believing it offered penance for their sins. She could sense that twisted attraction in the air, as though the rock was a magnet for guilty souls. At Walter's signal, they slipped the meteor, still wrapped in canvas, onto a metal cradle suspended over the inferno. They began lowering it with a crank. The heat ignited the canvas in seconds, flames licking around the rock's surface. As the cloth burned away, the meteor's swirling colors flared brighter, like an awakened beast. Harriet winced at the sight. The hum abruptly intensified to an ear-splitting wail, vibrating the forge's walls. Everyone clapped their hands over their ears, staggering. Through the shriek, Harriet saw the illusions appear in the smoke. Henry materialized right in front of her, reaching out with sorrowful eyes. She fought the compulsion to embrace him, to beg forgiveness. If she lost herself now, she might let the meteor go. She bit down on her lip until she tasted blood, forcing her mind to stay anchored in reality. Across the forge, Lucy gripped the workbench to keep her balance, her face twisted in despair as she saw visions Harriet couldn't make out. Walter, forging on, grimly rotated the crank. Colin, tears streaming, kept shoveling more fuel to intensify the heat. Sparks rained upward in an angry whirlwind. As the meteor glowed in unnatural red and white within the flames, Harriet could feel the mental grip loosening. The illusions flickered, Henry's form splintering. She watched, heart pounding in conflict, as the anguished expression on his face fractured into shards of light. She wanted to call out to him, to say she was sorry, but she knew he was only an echo of regret. This was the final moment of confrontation with her guilt. The Hume built to a crescendo. The meteor's surface cracked, revealing a molten interior that trickled out like liquid metal. It shimmered greenish blue, an alien color that made Harriet's eyes sting. With a terrific snap, the meteor split. A surge of scorching air exploded upward, toppling Colin and Walter. Harriet screamed and ducked, feeling the heat scald her cheeks. Smoky fragments shot into the air, rattling against the ceiling, carrying flickers of that haunting glow. But with each crack and fissure, the meteor's presence seemed to diminish, as though its power was bleeding away in the fire. The illusions flickered with every fracture, and Harriet saw Henry fade, replaced by swirling embers. Across the forge, Lucy swayed, tears turning to relieved sobs as her tormentor's image dissipated. Walter dared to look into the furnace. The meteor was no longer intact, just molten lumps in the swirling flame. The Hume dropped several octaves, then silenced altogether, leaving only the roar of the fire. All four of them stared at one another, breath caught in strained lungs. It felt as though they had awakened from a nightmare to find the day unexpectedly bright. In the following hours, a hush permeated the village. The illusions vanished, replaced by a fragile calm. Harriet stepped outside the forge and looked at the pale sky. No shimmering shapes haunted the roads. No sobs echoed from behind closed doors. Curious onlookers peeked out from their homes, uncertain but hopeful. It seemed the meteor's grip had perished in the flames, setting them all free. Each resident now carried private scars of guilt or pain that the meteor had dredged up. But perhaps, Harriet thought, the enforced confrontation offered a bitter mercy. It reminded them that the darkest secrets couldn't be locked away forever. Harriet herself felt a strange lightness. The guilt over Henry remained, but having faced his haunting presence night after night, she realized she could not continue punishing herself. The illusions had tormented her, yet they had also afforded her some kind of release. Henry was gone, and her guilt would linger. But it was up to her to decide how to live the life still in her hand. Over the next weeks, the village gradually recovered. Colin applied his leadership to rebuilding the shattered trust among neighbors. Lucy provided counseling for those who needed it, drawing on the empathy she had gained from her own ordeal. Walter poured his heart into forging new tools and strengthening the structures that had fallen into disrepair, a labor of atonement for the nights he'd surrendered to fear. And Harriet, she walked the farmland Henry had left behind, planting new seeds and restoring the orchard, each tree carefully pruned with patience. She still dreamed of Henry from time to time, though now he was simply a fond memory beneath the old apple tree, rather than a vengeful specter. Sometimes Harriet glanced at the smoldered remains in Walter's forge, where twisted lumps of foreign metal lay in a pile by the ashes. Faint shimmers still clung to the scraps. No one dared remove them from the forge's premises, and some villagers warned they should be buried deep in the earth. But as far as Harriet could tell, the fragments were inert now, their power a relic of a cosmic curse that had nearly devoured them all. Whether they would remain silent forever was a worry no one openly voiced. Uncertainty persisted, but they chose to hold on to hope. Late one afternoon, as the sky darkened with the threat of rain, Harriet lingered in the orchard. She ran her fingers along the trunk of the largest apple tree, remembering a day when Henry had carved a tiny heart into its bark. She closed her eyes, breathed in the damp scent of the grass. Though the nightmares had receded, the lessons remained. Harriet realized that no meteoric force was needed to conjure a person's guilt. It was always there, a shadow in the mind. But confronting it, learning to forgive oneself, was the only way to endure. And so she whispered a quiet goodbye to Henry, a hush that merged with the swelling wind, letting him go at last. A distant echo rumbled from the sky, thunder preceding the first droplets of rain. Harriet turned her face upward, allowing the water to run down her cheeks. She wondered if any new threat might someday crash from the heavens. If so, she had a village behind her, battle-tested. And she had found a measure of strength within herself, forged in the white-hot crucible of cosmic dread. She welcomed the storm, ready to face whatever might come next.